So we're going to call it really cool women who did some wild things in Jesus' past and present. You can imagine what we were thinking of titles. But we are going to be discussing for the next 6 weeks or so the different women who had influence on Jesus, whether they were his ancestors or they were around during his ministry on earth. Because it's pretty important where you come from, but it doesn't necessarily define you. And as we follow the paths of these different women and what they've done, there will be some important things you can see and notice and how that has influenced. You know, you get it. Yep. How's this?
No.
How about this? Come on. Hey. Hello. Okay. How about that? There we go. Okay. Well, good morning again. It's important to push the mute button before you start. So, alrighty. We're starting a new sermon series, and it's about the women in Jesus' past and then his present in his ministry on earth. And kind of the idea that we had behind this is that where you come from matters, but it doesn't necessarily define you. So it's important to be able to see what that looks like and how Jesus' past influenced his present and influenced his ministry on earth. And it's kind of just an interesting way to cover that and see how we can talk about and learn about how our own past and present kind of define our future. So to kind of introduce it, I'm going to read, I'm not going to read the whole thing, because genealogies are kind of boring, but I'm going to read part of Jesus' genealogy in Matthew. So it's on the screen, but just beware, I am skipping around because you don't need to know all. Well, you need to know all of it, but I'm not going to read all of it. Alright, so this is an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And here comes the first important part. And Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Now in the original genealogies, they don't mention women. But in Jesus' genealogy, they mention 5 women. And Tamar's the first one. And Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of a bunch of people who follow it down. And we've got the father of Boaz by Rahab. That's the next woman. And Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth. And Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. So you should be familiar with David a little bit. We've preached about him a couple times, and he's pretty famous. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Now that's another important one here. Now this is Bathsheba. They don't even mention her name. They define her by her husband, but the wife of Uriah. So she's the 4th one in there. And then we skip down a bunch, and we get to they're deported from Babylon, and that's really important. And then we've got Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So throughout that account, there's lots of ups and downs, right? There's lots of people whose names you maybe have no idea who they are. There's some that I'm like, I have no idea how to pronounce them. I'm not really sure where they are in the Bible. And then there's some that are a little more famous, like Solomon and David and Ruth. And important people, you know? So there's a lot going on there. But the most important part here for our message is that this was so important. This, 17 verses of people's names was incredibly important to the people of that time. And to us, it's like, wow, who are all these people we don't even know, right? We don't even remember some of them. But for them, that would have been an incredibly important thing to know where you come from, to know who you belong to know who you are, and to know what your history is. And if we can kind of dig into that and understand that a little bit, then that can tell us a lot about who Jesus is, and it can tell us a lot about what your past might be. So that's kind of a broad view of what the sermon series is going to look like. But today we are going to talk about Tamar, the first woman that was mentioned in there. This story is kind of a lot, so I'm just going to summarize it, but it's from Genesis 38, the scriptures in your bulletin if you want to follow along. But I'm not going to read it because it's So Tamar, we need to back up a little bit, and we're going to start with Judah. So Judah is Tamar's father-in-law. Now Judah is the son of Jacob. That means he's also Joseph of the code of many colors, that Joseph's brother. So he comes from that family. Now, Judah, the story starts off that Judah left his brothers and moved into a different town. So he moved away from his whole family. He moved there and he kind of settled down, he found a wife, and he had 3 kids. Now this is where Tamar enters the story. His first kid, he promises in marriage to Tamar, they get married, but this first kid is like a rod name. I don't really know why, we don't know why, but God says nope and smites him. So Tamar, she's a widow. She's kind of left hanging out, right? Now Judah's got 2 more sons. And in this time period, this historical context, it was very important that your first son carried on your lineage, right? It's passed on. We read 17 verses of genealogy. So it's very important where you come from. And then it passes through the first son. Now, if the first son is no longer able to do that because it's been smited, it's important to keep that journey going. So it's important to keep that going. And so we've got the second son. Now, the second son's duty, his duty to keep with honor, his obligation, and to do the right thing, is to then get married to Tamar and have a kid in the name of his brother. So Judah says, second son, go do this thing. And he gets married, but he doesn't really do everything he's supposed to, so Tamar doesn't have any kids. And everyone thinks that he's doing good, right? Because they're like, he's definitely married to her, like they seem like they're following the law, but she doesn't have any kids, and God sees and he knows, so he smites her as well. So now Tamar, she's hanging out. And she's been married to 2 people who have both died. So Judah thinks, you know what, I've got a 3rd son, and I'm supposed to marry that kid to Tamar. But Tamar seems like she's maybe a bad luck charm or something, so I don't know if I want to give my last kid to her, right? Which is not good, because it's not Tamar's fault. His sons are terrible people, apparently. We don't really know why. Well, we know why the middle one's terrible. But the first one, not really sure, but he's bad. And his father just kind of ignores that, maybe he doesn't know. I don't know. We're not given that information. But regardless, Judah decides that it's probably Tamar's fault. So he says, okay, Tamar, go back and live with your father, and when my 3rd son gets old enough, because apparently the 3rd son's like a little kid right now, so you can't marry again. So he says, go back and live there, and then when Tamar gets old, or Tamar's already old, when my son gets old enough, you can get married. Tamar's like, okay, sounds good. So she goes back and lives with her father. All of a sudden, it comes along that the 3rd son is old enough, but still hasn't been promised to marry to Tamar. So Tamar's kind of getting suspicious, right? And she's really stuck in this moment. She's pretty much needs to be married to be able to do anything because of societal standards. A lot of people are potentially viewing her as kind of like maybe a woman that's a problem, right? Because 2 of her husbands have died. So she's kind of stuck, but she hasn't been released from this obligation to Judah's family. Now, Judah's not going to give her to the 3rd son. He's supposed to carry on the lineage himself and have a kid with her. Which sounds crazy and wild, but that was just the tradition of the time. So you kind of have to just look at that in context and ignore whatever your brain is thinking about that idea of your father-in-law having a kid with you. But that's what happens. And so somebody tells Tamar that Judah has gone up to some festival or something, and she says, okay, I know what I'm going to do. So she goes up, she veils her face so that he doesn't know who she is, and he thinks she's a prostitute. And he's like, oh, this is fun. How about I do this? And Tamar says, okay, but what are you going to give me? He doesn't know it's Tamar. And he says, I'll give you a goat. Guess that's the going rate. So she says, okay, that's fine, but you're not going to give me a goat right now. I need some collateral. She's a smart woman. So he gives her his seal and his staff. Now this is incredibly important here. Giving someone your seal, that's like your signet ring, so you have to sign things with that. If you give that to somebody, that's pretty much like most of your contracts and everything are kind of like null. And you've given away your ability to sign things. That was a big thing that he gave away. So he gives that away to her, and then the because, what they do. And then it turns out she gets pregnant. And so the people in town start talking. So they're like, she's not married, she's pregnant. It's pretty crazy, right? So Judah, being a good Israelite man, says, okay, time to burn her at the stake. Terrible, right? But then she says, no, Judah. I have the seal and the staff of the man who's the father. And then she gives them to him. He's like, oh boy, this isn't good. So he's not going to burn at the stake, because that'd be bad, because it's his kid. Right? Regardless of any other reasons, it's bad to burn at the stake. But it's his kid. And so what he does is he stands up in front of people, who knows who, and he says, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son. He acknowledges that he did wrong. It's probably the most important part of this story, is that regardless of all the ups and downs along the way, is that at the end, Judah recognizes that he has done wrong. He hasn't followed his obligation. He hasn't followed what is honorable. He hasn't followed what is right to do. He left Tamar in this kind of limbo, in a place where it's very easy for her to be judged, pushed aside, and kind of left alone. She doesn't have any kids, so when her father dies, she's going to be completely without anything, because she has no kids to help her, no husband, no nothing. And she's a woman in this time period. There's nothing for her. And so Judah's really slacked off in his duty here. And so he recognizes that. He says, she did the right thing. This is something that I was supposed to do, and I didn't do it. So this story is like a lot, right? It's just, there's so much going on. And if you're reading it in today's context, it's even so much more. Because it's the history and the obligations and the rules and all that stuff, it just doesn't really make sense with what we believe we follow, what it means to be a good husband, a good wife, a good family member, father, or whatever. Those different rules and obligations and what it means to do that right, to do that correctly, is different. But if we can step back and take ourselves out of our own context and just view it differently, we can learn a lot from this story. I think the best way to kind of know what's going on is to break it into two parts. We've got the main players really are Judah and Tamar. So pretty much everyone else gets smited. And so those are the two most important parts. So we start with Judah. Now I don't want to give Judah too much credit, because he kind of was the worst for a while. But he comes back around again. But if we can step into his context, he moved away from his brother. So he moved into a different land. So he's kind of alone, right? His sons, two of them, have died. And he's got one left. And he says that it's Tamar's fault. That's not what is in his head. That's what's implied through the scripture. But maybe in the back of his head he's got some guilt. We don't know. I don't want to place that on him. But you can think that potentially there's some guilt going on in the back of his head. And maybe I shouldn't have moved away. Maybe I shouldn't have married this Canaanite. His wife was a Canaanite. And God said, don't marry Canaanites. And he did. So he thinks, well, maybe this is my fault. And again, I'm not trying to place that on him. I'm not trying to read too much into it. But potentially that's in the back of his head. But he's also got this sense of obligation and this sense of fear. Because if his lineage is not carried on, he's nothing. We read how important this genealogy is. Matthew's gospel starts off by telling us where Jesus came from. That's how important it is. So if Judah can't continue his lineage, he's nothing. So he's a little panicked at this point. He's got one chance left. He's not really sure what to do. And not only that, he's got God's promise. As one of the sons of Abraham extended out, he's supposed to be a grand family. It's supposed to be a huge thing for him out here as God's chosen people. And so far he's failing. So he's got a lot going against him. And because of that, he makes bad choices. Now this doesn't excuse his choices, but it maybe gives us a little bit of a background. Maybe explains versus excuses. Then we've got Tamar. She's a little more important here, right? Because she's directly mentioned in this genealogy. She's the mother, extended many generations, of Jesus, essentially. She's got almost nothing going for her. She's a woman in this time, so she's defined by her husband and her sons. No matter what. Her first husband dies. Her second husband dies. Her third husband doesn't exist. She doesn't get to get married to him. She has no honor left because her two husbands have died. She hasn't had kids. She's got nothing to define what it means to be a good woman in this time period. And not only that, if Judah were to release her from this obligation, she's going to be seen as something that's kind of tainted, because she's already been married once. And finally, she takes this brand step, and maybe isn't the best, I don't know, of tricking Judah. And there's a lot of potential for fallout there, right? She's done a lot of things that are not so good. And there's a lot of potential. She had this plan with the seal and the staff, right? To show this to Judah when she got pregnant so that he wouldn't end up burning her at the stake or doing something else horrible. But that might not have worked. Men have a lot of power. And Judah had quite a lineage that he came from. And he could fall back on. So he had a lot of power. So she was maybe didn't make the right choice? I don't know. But regardless of if it was a good choice or a bad choice, it was a really dangerous choice. So she was really had nothing left, nothing going for her. Now in the story, Judah finds redemption, right? Because he acknowledges that he screwed up. At the end of the story, he says, "You are more righteous than I." He straight up says, "I'm wrong," which is wild. People don't do that, especially when it's something this big and this high profile. It's very rare for someone to sit down and be like, "It was me, I was wrong." And he doesn't give a but. He doesn't say, "I was wrong, but this." He says, "I was wrong, she was right." And some of the translations, it literally says, "She is more right than I am." So he has some kind of redemption in it. But Tamar doesn't really have redemption in this story, right? She's got nothing going for her, and it just ends with her having some kids. She has twins, which is good because she now has someone to take care of her in her old age, and she's carrying on Judah's lineage. But she's still kind of pushed aside. Now, why do we read this story? That was something that I asked myself a lot this last week. Because it doesn't really seem like there's anything good to come out of it, except for Jesus' birth forever later. It doesn't really feel like there's a reason that this is highlighted, that it has a whole chapter of the Bible that's about her. But it is important. There is a reason to read it. It's very important. It's so important that Tamar is mentioned in Matthew's Gospel as part of Jesus' line. So how do we see that in Jesus' ministry? What does that mean for us today? Now, Jesus would have known his genealogy. He would have known where he came from. And we come back to know Jesus is both fully human and fully divine, which is really confusing and not what this sermon is about. But for just the sake of now, there's a part of Jesus that's fully human, and that's the part we're really talking about. Because his human side comes from this story of just a mess. Just like a whole pile of, oh my goodness, like so many skeletons in the closet, the black sheep of the family. Jesus got a lot going on in this history. We've only come with one woman here. There's 4 more to go that really, it's a lot going on, right? The men and the women that Jesus is pastor, crazy. There's so much happening. But Jesus knew this, right? And God knew this, and God still let all of these broken people who made bad decisions and good decisions, and admitted they were wrong and didn't admit they were wrong, all the way through, he still lets Jesus come from that line. He still lets people remember that Jesus comes from that line. He doesn't try to say Jesus was pure and perfect. He was. But his human side, he doesn't say that Jesus comes from purity. He doesn't say that Jesus comes from perfection. Instead, he takes all of that hot mess and makes perfection out of it. Which is a really cool redemption story overall, but doesn't know Tamar. So why do we care about Tamar? Why is she important? I think that there's another woman in Jesus' ministry where he brings redemption for Tamar. The woman of Samaria, the Samaritan woman, and the woman at the well. Now, if you don't remember this story, I'm going to give you a quick refresher. Jesus was wandering about doing his ministry, and he comes through Samaria. And Samaritans and Jews, they're just like, they don't mix. It's like Auburn and Alabama. You just don't do it. But he did, right? It's Jesus. That's right. And so it's crazy that they're talking. But he goes through Samaria, and he is hot and wants a drink, so he sits by this well. There's a really important part of the story where they say it's Jacob's well. Now, we are so many generations. Remember, Jacob is the father of Judah. So Jacob is pretty closely linked to Tamar. And so we're at Jacob's well here. And Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman, and she's like, why are you talking to me? That's really weird. And then a lot of stuff happens. And then he says, go call your husband. And she says, I have no husband. And Jesus says, that's right, you don't. You've had 5, and the man you're with now isn't your husband. Now, it's not the same story as Tamar, but it's similar. The idea of a woman who has, well, all women really were defined by their men, but a woman who's really become defined by problematic relations with men. She's someone who probably has very little honor in her village. There's someone who people probably cross the street and don't walk on the same side. They probably tell their daughters, don't be like her. Don't do what she did. Now, Jesus knows this woman's whole story. He knows that she is a lot. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot that people probably don't know about her. The reason that she's done the things she's done may not be good. She may justify them to herself. She may justify them to others. Maybe good, maybe bad. Who knows? Who hurt her? Where it came along the line. But regardless, there's problems. And Jesus sees this. And maybe his human side is looking back at Tamar and saying, you know what? Tamar never received redemption. Tamar never got someone to look at her and say, you know what? You're still valuable. But Jesus can say that to this Samaritan woman. He can say that to this woman at the well. He can look her in the eyes and say, it's okay. Because he didn't say, it's not written in the Bible, you're right, you don't have a husband, Jesus says and smirks. That's not how it is. Jesus just says, you're right, you have a husband. You've had 5 husbands. You're correct in saying that. And it's so powerful that he sees her and he recognizes her that she goes and tells everyone in her village. And not only does she tell them, but they believe her. And they come back, and Jesus stays for 2 more days. Maybe it was his plan to stay for 2 days. Maybe it was his plan to keep going, but he ended up staying because of that woman's testimony to lead her whole village to come back to talk to him. Now again, this woman had no honor. Yet when she ran back into the village and said, come meet this guy, he told me everything about me, he's a prophet, he's crazy, come listen to him, they all listened to her. That's crazy. First of all, that they listened to a woman. Second of all, that they listened to this woman who had quite the reputation. Jesus redeems Tamar through this grand history by seeing and recognizing the Samaritan woman. Now, what does that mean for us today? Well, number one, there are broken people all around us. Sometimes all that they need is someone to recognize them and not react to their story, but instead to just listen and just treat them like a person, because their story doesn't necessarily matter. Their story matters, but the bad parts and the messy parts doesn't matter to your interaction with them. You can still treat them like any other person. Which sounds very similar to my other sermon that I just preached very recently about loving people who are different from you. But don't worry, this one's different. I promise. I don't just have one sermon and I just mix up the Bible verses. But what's important here is it's important to love people who are different. But there's something even easier than that you can start with. Jesus knows he has this story of rejection and mishaps and fear and all of that going on in his history. And his human side knows that. And then in his ministry on earth, he looks after the least and the lost. He looks after those people who have been pushed aside. Maybe in his head when he's talking to this Samaritan woman, he's thinking Tamar. He's thinking Bathsheba. He's thinking Ruth. He's thinking Rahab. Maybe he's thinking all of these women in the back of his head when he's talking to Samaritan women and giving her redemption. You don't have to have a personal connection to care about people. Care about a specific type of people or people who have done something. That's not necessary. You should care about all people. You should love all people. That's what God calls us to do. But when you do have that personal connection, you should use it. Just like Jesus does when he says, I come from a mess. Therefore, when I meet people who are seen as a mess, it doesn't matter. So a couple weeks ago, I gave you kind of a lot. It was like a big challenge, right? Like, love people who are different from you. This week it's a little easier. Find that thing that you've experienced, or you've seen a family member go through, or a friend or a neighbor go through, and turn that into a call for compassion. If things happen or you see things that are hard, that's a way you can turn that into compassion and specific ways to understand how to relate to people who are struggling. If you had a kid who didn't really make friends in school, and you watch that kid go through that, maybe when you're in a social situation, think about that. When you see someone off to the side, go talk to them. Invite them back into the conversation. If you have watched a family member or some family go through someone who has faced addiction, and you know what that's like, figure out how to use that as a call, personal life call for compassion for people who have faced that. Now again, you don't have to have a personal connection to care about people. In fact, that shouldn't be relevant. But if you do, there's no reason not to use it. I think that's what St. Mark can teach us. That's what the grand redemption story that leads to Jesus' even grander redemption story can teach us. So if you've got a reason to care, you sure as heck better use it. You would bow your heads and pray with me. Dear Lord, thank you for allowing us to be part of this story, no matter how messed up or dirty or crazy or whatever this story is. Lord, thank you that we can be part of it. Thank you for sharing every part of that story with us. Lord, help us to remember your redemption story, the way you redeemed the people throughout the history, and the way that you continue to redeem them through Jesus. Lord, help us to see people like Jesus did, and see ways to redeem when you think it's too late, to remember that it's never too late to redeem somebody, and to tell them and make them know that they're seen and loved. Lord, thank you for giving us difficult scriptures to follow through and think through so that we can really understand, try to understand who you are and who your Son is. It's in your name we pray.
Let's stand and sing, God loves me.